to Diego Falls, Patagonia, and as I was down through the facility in Argentina, he was telling me the story of finding the specimen. And he said, so they went out, and they went to this very, very cold, bleak area of Patagonia. They've been down there, and they found this Titanosaurus femur, and they were so happy. It was 2 meters long. This is fantastic. They dug a little more than no, it's older than the medicine, right? Then they kept going, and now 6 of them. He was not so happy with that. Because having to excavate 6 of these enormous heaps, basically, you have to do like a cleaned out, and he said, okay, now let's spend the rest of my life here. But at any rate, so this is a product of the museum science. I think it is one of the most interesting things we have in the museum. I think it was the second most posted image in New York City in this year. So that's the product of the museum science we see on Clinton. Now, we're going to transition tonight to our topic, which is, I don't know if you realize, there's an election going on. Well, it has been 34 years or so. Not so much in New York, of course. But anyway, we're going to election here. I like to go to the candidates do this. And I remember the first time I voted, I won't tell you who that was one party, but still. And I asked my father, who did you vote for? Who do you vote for this time? He said, I vote for the guy that loses. That was his lock on statistics. Whoever you voted for will lose. And I followed that tradition in my town. I'm a member of a party with 3 actual registered members. Myself, my son, and a woman who's incarcerated. So that's the entire party affiliation in my town, in my party. But actually tonight, we have the honor of hearing Sam Wong talk to us about an honest to goodness analysis of statistics of the election. Sam is a professor of neurosciences and molecular biology at Princeton University, a small liberal arts college. Heard about it. And he got his interest. I actually asked him ahead of time, how did you get your interest in doing these sorts of things? He said, well, it was actually by winning a bet, a discussion with a physicist. Now, I know we all enjoy winning arguments with physicists, right? It gives you that. That's the basic. And so I'd like to welcome Sam Wong. If you enjoyed the talk, so Sam, please come up and tell us about your results.
Thank you for a very kind introduction. I should say that this is not it's very good. Extremely pleased to be asked. There's no money involved. Betting is wrong. Okay, wow, there are a lot of you here tonight. I'm so pleased. I apologize for Josh Cass not here. I actually admire Josh's work at the Upshot quite a lot, and I was really looking forward to meeting him in person. He and I correspond a lot. When you get into these funny hobbies with data analysis and data analytics, you end up making friends with people you never have met. And in the course of this funny hobby that I've developed, I've ended up meeting people all over the United States, all over the world, who never met in person. They've contributed code to my website. I occasionally talk to them on the phone very occasionally. And Josh is one of those people whose work I really love a lot. And so I'm going to try my best to carry the fallen torch for Josh and do my best tonight. So Josh has the flu. I myself am a little teeny tiny bit under the weather, and so I'm going to hope to turn this over to your questions as soon as possible, because I think your questions are the most interesting of all, and I'm really looking forward to those. So let me just talk a little bit about how one predicts elections using statistics and exactly how it is that has increased the analysis of data for elections. I should say that in my day job, I do a lot of data analysis. We do in vivo microscopy to understand brain circuit processing in using things like two-photon microscopy. That's what we do a lot. It turns out that those often involve data problems, and I often use languages like MATLAB, Python to analyze large data sets. And this thing that Ward told you about, this discussion I got into in 2004, was the beginning of applying some of those data analysis techniques. And I'll be honest with you, these are simple data analysis techniques. I can tell you, I can say safely that a lot of you could just go home and do them yourself. And I think that what I do is a pretty democratizing hobby in the sense that anybody can do it. I need to give some disclaimers. So, as I said, I'm a physical scientist. I actually majored in physics a long time ago in college. I became a neuroscientist. And so I don't have a background in political science. So I just want to talk a little bit about this icon of politics. Robert Kennedy, from a less polarized age, and from the fact that both sides of the aisle admired him greatly. And I want to start by using his words to inspire what it is that I do, my little hobby that I do that kind of flowers up every 4 years or so, sometimes every 2 years. So Bob Kennedy inspired people with this phrase, this aphorism. Some men don't say why I dream things that never were. And these are words that really inspire. I put it on online, and I posted it to some little political website, and to my surprise, it went viral. This is in 2004, and it's one poll. So the polling was quite powerful. The entire profession is composed of people who have great technical standards. They do a good job of, in the aggregate, guessing who's going to vote, and that wisdom of crowds, where the crowds are not individual, say, bidders in the market, but individual pollsters, they do a good job of predicting how people are voting. If you look here, the 538 model in 2008, the first year that this really hit the big time when Nate Silver had his own website doing it, that was 348.5 electoral votes. If you just look at a polling snapshot at the Princeton Election Consortium, the website I run, it came a little bit closer, and if we really integrated polls over time, it came extremely close and came within one electoral vote of the final outcome. The same is true of the popular vote. The same is true if you look at ratings in polls in the House of Representatives. Overall, and of course in the Senate, overall polls do an extremely good job. And what this means is that we can rely on the judgment of pollsters, and we can go to places like Huffington Post, pollster.com, to get high-quality data that, when aggregated properly, can do really robust, simple statistics that any of you in this room can do with a pencil and paper. You can do this in the comfort of your own couch or what have you. And anybody can do this, and I think it's a testament to the polling profession. So now I've created this site. This is actually a slightly old snapshot, so don't pay any attention to what it says here. But I took this snapshot a month ago, but I just have to show you this is what it looks like now. And you can see that it's a bit homegrown, right? And so my motivation in doing this is a little bit different from commercial sites that say give you horse race and give a lot of color commentary. I think this has become like sports color commentary, and I just want to say that my fundamental motivation in keeping this activity up is something that I think again may matter to many of you, which is that not just to understand where the race is at, which is an important part of poll aggregation, but also understanding where your own efforts can make a difference, right? Because I presume, I hope, that most of you are going to vote on Tuesday. But in addition to voting, maybe you'd like to know where your efforts are most valuable. Maybe you'd like to know what candidates are going to benefit the most from money contributed. Or maybe you'd like to know where to go to get out the vote, because you're interested in who controls the Senate or who controls the House, right? Because you'd like to know, you'd like to have some influence on Congress, because Congress has to work with the president, whoever she's going to be. So, the general idea is that, in fact, just to give away the ending, there is not that much uncertainty left about who's going to be president. The presidential election is, I would say, from a statistical standpoint, unless something very surprising happens, I mean really surprising, it's pretty likely that Hillary Clinton is going to win next Tuesday in this result. Always good for applause and victory. So I think that is highly likely to occur. And so, therefore, obviously it is a civic duty and a civic good for us to vote. Voting makes us better people. Voting is the thing we do as part of our country. But if you want to have more influence, the vote itself is not the only thing that matters. You can have 100 to 1,000 times more than the power of your own individual vote by going out to Long Island and getting out the vote in key swing districts, by going to northern New Jersey to the 5th district, by, if you happen to be, traveling a little bit further afield, getting out the vote in Pennsylvania in the Senate race, or New Hampshire in the Senate race. Knowing the probabilities, gives you a guide as to how to, in fact, do a good job of allocating your resources. And if you look here, if you go to election.princeton.edu, you can see, in fact, I have a little, I'm not going to click on it because this is not actually a live web link, but you can find nearby competitive House districts. Over here, if you were to scroll down, you can see the power of your vote and see which Senate races are closest. Right now, the biggest point of suspense in the election next Tuesday is who's going to end up in control of the Senate. That could go either way. There's 47 seats that are almost certainly going to be Democratic or Independent, and there's 6 more seats that are all within 1 or 2 percentage points right now, where those 6 seats could go either way. And what that means is that anywhere between 47 and 53 Senate seats could belong to the Democrats plus Independents next Tuesday. And that has a big influence on what the president is going to be facing in terms of getting cabinet appointments approved, Supreme Court appointments. And so my view is that mass helps activism. Now let me just move along here because I promised you that I wouldn't talk for too long, but let me just talk a little bit about the math of it a little bit. It's not that, in some sense it's not that complicated. For purposes of credibility, I have to show you a little scrap of the code. I can tell you that if you are interested in this, you can go to the website. I make all the code publicly available. So if you go to election.princeton.edu/code, you can download all the code and play with it yourself. And this is just a little snippet of it. This is actually the main body of the code, where basically what I do is I take the median of all available polls. If you take the median, this is a way where you can get rid of outliers. You don't have to worry about Donald Trump and go Republican. Ohio, at the time I made this slide, could go either way. New York, extremely likely to be Democratic. And I can take these and compound these probabilities and make this histogram, which is a histogram of all the possibilities, where it's anywhere from, this graph from 220 electoral votes to 400, and I think most people by now know that it takes 270 to win. And so at the time, this is in late September, even at that time, Hillary Clinton was ahead. And so it's possible to get a snapshot, a low noise photograph of exactly where the race is. It's like a thermometer that goes up and down, and one can do this using publicly available data. So election.princeton.edu does this. We have a data feed that we get from the good people at Huffington Post. And so this updates automatically, and it allows you to see what's going on with these two. Now, it is odd that just showing this slide immediately makes you laugh. It just goes to show that this is a pretty unusual political year. These are among two of the most famous people on the planet. I can say with a lot of confidence that almost every one of this room loathes at least one of these people. It's an unusual situation. I have to say that this is interesting. You might think that that's a cheap laugh, and if you're under the age of 40 or so, then you think, oh, of course I hate one of those candidates. But that didn't used to be the case. Approval ratings for presidential candidates have gone steadily down since the Eisenhower administration, and it's been more and more the case that people feel very negatively about one candidate or the other. And this has continued, and this is why, despite the fact that one of these candidates is going to win the presidency, Donald Trump here has the highest disapproval rating, the approval minus disapproval rating of something like minus 30 points. And so this is why he's a contender for the presidency. Hillary Clinton is the third most disliked candidate. And so these ratings, the only one to come between them is Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater is the second most negative political presidential nominee. And so we're in this unusual time when ratings have gone down and down and down. And this is unusual, and I want to come back to this in a minute. I think it's very important to think about this, because if you stop and think about it, many public figures who suffer from these negative approval ratings are people who if we met them in person, we would be very impressed with them. If you think about Barack Obama or Mitt Romney or Hillary Clinton, these are people who, if you met them in person, if they were in your community, they would probably be among the most impressive people you know. And yet, it is still the case that their approval ratings are underwater. All three of those people I just mentioned, at the time that they were most in the public eye, had not very good approval ratings. And so there's an unusual something happening in our politics, and I hope to get that to that in the discussion. Now, despite the fact that Trump and Mitt Romney are very different people, one thing that's very unusual that I just want to show you here graphically is this cartogram. This is the closest we're going to get to a wonderful map, because Josh Cass isn't here. But this is a cartogram showing polling margins in 2012 and polling margins about a month ago in 2016. And you can see here that geographically, just if you look here, blue states and red states, and the states that are right on a nice edge, the overall pattern of states here is strikingly similar between 2012 and 2016. And this just goes to show that if you stop and think about it, Mitt Romney and Donald Trump are, to put it mildly, very different people stylistically, like really different stylistically. And despite that fact, their support that they enjoy against their opponents, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, their support is in fact almost identical, and the geography of political preference is almost unchanged from 4 years ago. And that is, again, something that's unusual. That didn't used to be the case. If you look at elections going back to 60 and 64, things used to change quite a lot from year to year, and actually 60 to 64 is a time of tremendous change. And now the geography of voting has actually changed not very much. So I told you that there's a snapshot, and I just want to get into how one makes a prediction. Basically, the snapshot allows one to calculate the virtual margin for how much one candidate is ahead of the other. So you can take all the polls and say, okay, the snapshot shows Hillary Clinton ahead by this much. How much, if we moved all the polls by the same amount, if we moved all the polls towards Donald Trump by the same amount, and created a situation where it was a perfect electoral toss-up, where we just had no idea who would be ahead, then by that amount is what I call meta margin, and this is a quantity that can be tracked up and down. And now I have a single number where I can just do simple statistics and just say, okay, what's the average of that? What's the standard deviation of that? And I can study that number as it moves up and down. And you can see here, this is the meta margin as it moves back and forth, and this red line indicates a perfect tie, and this black curve goes up and down. And I think you can see here that what's most notable about this is first that it moves up and down a little bit, where Clinton was anywhere from 1.5 points ahead in this meta margin to close to 6.5 or 7 percentage points ahead. But the most notable thing about this I want you to notice is that despite all the emotional aspects of this year's race, where I think many of us have been pretty emotional about this year's race, what's notable is that about your own emotional history, about however you have felt about this political race this year. It may not necessarily match what is here in the graph. If I showed you this in a financial chart, you'd say, oh yeah, that's a boring stock. Yeah, okay, nothing's happened. That's just boring. But this is presumably not how you feel about this year's presidential race. So you look down here, this is the likely range of error between the polls and what's finally going to happen on election day. Think of this as a hurricane strike zone, where the red zone here is the 1 sigma strike zone, so about 2/3 of the time we can expect an outcome that's in that range. About 95% of the time it will be in the yellow range, which is what I call 2 sigma zone. And so at this point, it looks, I would say, overwhelmingly likely that we know who's going to be the president, and it's going to be, as I said, the Democratic nominee. Now, again, I just want to emphasize that there is something unusual this year that becomes more apparent when you look at long-time trends. And here, I just want to show you that presidential campaigns have actually gotten less volatile statistically, even though they have become more volatile emotionally. And so if you think about all the emotional aspects of this year's campaign, all the fairly wrenching events, look at this now in terms of electoral votes. Here, when John Kerry was running against President Bush in 2004, the total swing here was 120 electoral votes. And you can see here that the race actually changed leads several times. And there was a period during the race during which Kerry was ahead, a period during which George W. Bush was ahead, and of course, George W. Bush ended up winning. If you look here, the total range is 90 electoral votes. This is now Barack Obama running against John McCain. And you can see here that for this one magical moment, for about a week after Sarah Palin joined the ticket, McCain had fought Obama to a standstill, and if there had been an election the week after the Republican convention, there's a good chance that McCain would have won the presidency that year. But if you look here in 2012 with the Obama re-election campaign, now you see this situation in which the swing is even lower, 70 electoral votes. And now, this year's campaign, the total range is only 50 electoral votes. And I'm sorry, I made a mistake here. The units of this graph are actually in meta margin. But I can tell you that the total overall range here is only 50 electoral votes. And what that means is that we have an unusually stable, almost static presidential race this year, which is quite odd. Now, it turns out that it's possible to look at polling data from past years and see that, in fact, this is a fairly new thing. And this is now national polling data that Chris Elysian and Robert Erickson have put together in a book called The Timeline of Presidential Elections. And this is now differences between polls and the final outcome, where on this side it means that polls are more Democratic than the outcome, this side is more Republican than the outcome. And you can see, it's probably too small to read here, but this is 20 points range. And so here when Eisenhower defeated Stevenson, the polls moved by about 10 points, which means the swing was 20 points. In 56, in the re-election campaign for Eisenhower again, you can see some pretty big events, like in the Carter-Reagan race. That was a dramatic race. There, the margin was Carter ahead by 40 points, and then Reagan ahead by something like 20 to 25 points. And in the end, of course, Reagan won by 10 points. And so you can see here that there are some pretty big swings. And if you look here, in 1996, those swings suddenly became much smaller. And so this is really a big lesson. If you could look back in time, in our adult lifetime, the major feature of presidential politics is that voters have become entrenched. Voters have become unwilling to change their minds, even during a campaign. They've been, even from presidential election to election year, in a particular state, a red state like Georgia, or Texas, a blue state like Vermont, or perhaps Michigan. Right? The fact that we can even say red state and blue state is an artifact of current times when states don't really change partisan identity. And so just to show you, here's a measure. This is the standard deviation, which is a measure of how much a race moves. The standard deviation means 2/3 of the time the race stays within its average by this many points. And so if you look here, in 1992, this is the Clinton versus Bush Perot race. 2/3 of the time it was within 14 or 15 points of its average. That's a pretty wide range. If you look here in Eisenhower, 2/3 of the time it was within 10 points before it ended up. But if you look here, there's a sudden drop where suddenly races became more stable. If you think about your political history, that was a pretty interesting time in the mid-1990s. That was a time when Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House. That was a time when Rush Limbaugh became a star of talk radio. That was a time when national politics became nationalized by things like the Contract with America, and the Republican Party adopted a national platform, adopted instant ways of communicating with one another through talk radio. Fox News started in the late 1990s. And so a lot of things happened in U.S. politics at that time. And ever since that time, politics has become much more stable. And if you look at this meta margin that I talked about, This year, the standard deviation of the net margin is less than 1 percentage point. So really, we are talking about, actually it's gone up since I made this graph, but it's still less than 2 percentage points. And so we're talking about because racism becomes static. So just to orient you, I started my website at this time, Nate Silver entered the scene at this time, and as you can see here, it's kind of a funny irony that we have gotten into this hobby right around the time that races got super stable. So, you know, I mean, interesting, right? But it's also a time when a lot of data is available. So, as I already said, there's this, let me just see where it's gone here. As I already said, there's this funny situation in which we feel very negatively about the other party's candidate, and so as I said, you're going to dislike one of these two people. And that is part of what political scientists call polarization. And now I want to turn back to a little bit of an explanation. I said I was going to say how things are. I want to now mix up with political science a little bit and talk about this phenomenon of polarization in which we often find our opponents to be unacceptable. It is unthinkable to vote for a candidate of the opposing party, and that is very much a feature of modern politics. And I think that it's important to think about the fact that politics has gotten very strange in the last few years, and in the last 20 years, and in some ways it has reached its peak now. And so think of Donald Trump as not an aberration of political processes, but think of him as a culmination of where his party has been going for the last 20 years. Now, it turns out that in a year like this, political science theories often fail. And so there's a theory called the party decides, which means that party actors like donors, like elected officials, other insiders, work together to figure out who's going to be acceptable as a nominee. And when you apply that good political science theory as the subject of a lot of discussion, then you end up with something like this, which is the famous essay that Nate Silver wrote back last August called Donald Trump's 6 Stages of Doom. And he asserted with a lot of confidence that, look, Trump's chance of becoming the GOP nominee is 2%. No way. And he came up with some math to do it. But basically, it was more along the lines of a big essay saying, dude, there's no possible way this could happen because the party usually decides. And you know, he was certainly correct that the logic of the party decides suggested that it wouldn't happen. But I would say, think about it a little bit differently. Think about it as a syllogism where well-functioning parties decide, the Republican Party picks Trump. The Republican Party at a national level is not well-functioning. And so I think what we're seeing here is however strong the Republican Party may be at a local level, it is not a strong party at a national level. And it was ready basically, think of it as a failed state, and think of Donald Trump as a warlord. He came in and took over. Okay, so it turns out that if you look at Mitt Romney's rise 4 years ago, he had a lot of competition from Herman Cain, Rick Perry, Ron Paul, Newt Gingrich. There's all kinds of people who got in the way of Mitt Romney, but in fact, Trump never had that issue. If you look at the polls, Trump really leapt to the front, and this just goes to show that in fact his stands are in fact very much to the liking of a large sector of the Republican Party. Enough so that in a field of 17 candidates, he was in a stronger position for the nomination than anybody on either party since George W. Bush or Al Gore in 2000. Trump really was the favorite of something like 30 or 40% of Republican voters from the beginning, and he never lost the lead. So I think that this is a testament to the fact that if you're not sure about political science, then polls will often give you the right answer. Okay, so I just want to say that there are other ways to predict vote, and I want to line this up pretty soon, but I just want to show you, this is too small for you to see, but this is kind of a fun experiment that one of my readers on my website did. I mentioned to you that my readers are a big source of code and insight. One of my readers, who goes by the pseudonym M, used Google Correlate, and what she found during the primaries was that it was possible to predict how a state would go in the primaries simply by pouring polls into Google Correlate and finding out, using those polls, what are the most popular Google search terms, and then using those search terms then to figure out what the vote would be in states where there's no polling available. And she did a great job. And I find this to be kind of fascinating because we usually think about getting interested in whether people are evangelicals or single suburbanites or what have you. But these search terms give this interesting look into what kinds of cultural tokens appear in states where candidates are strong. I just want to start on the right here. John Kasich, the #1 search term that correlates state by state with support for Kasich is net cost. Okay? Renewable portfolio standards, green buildings, Stiglitz, green infrastructure, right? NPR the stall. Will you guys wake up? Wake up. But these are, in many ways, like really sober terms. Now, if you look at Ted Cruz searches, #1 search term, family photo poses. Baby car seat, self-Christmas stocking, right? Scentsy plug-in, yeah. Crock-pot enchiladas, how to make the living. My favorite one is utter cover. Muy auténtico. But then there's other things here, like this is sort of funny here, like if you look at correlates of Donald Trump search terms, there's some funny stuff going on here. If you're in the front, you can read this, and it's stuff like, I mean, this is kind of funny stuff. The #1 search term is Degrassi season 13. How many people here in this room have heard of Degrassi? Right? It's a TV show about Canadian teenagers, and they have all kinds of real-life experiences. And do you think that Degrassi viewers are voting for Donald Trump? No, I don't think so. So this is super interesting, and this ties back to a thing that Josh Cass and Dale Irwin did for the New York Times that was fantastic, which was an article they did that I encourage you to look up called The Geography of Trumpism. And the idea was, what do you find on a county-by-county basis in the American Community Survey is correlated with support for Donald Trump? And what they found was things like people who had not finished high school, high fraction of people who live in mobile homes, people who work in old manufacturing jobs, right, so real Rust Belt stuff. And if you think about those kinds of communities where there's a lot of people like that, who's using the internet in those communities? The kids. And so I think what's going on here, I'm just going to indulge in a little bit of cheap sociology here. I think what's going on here is that in places where the kids are the ones using the internet, you end up with search terms like Degrassi Season 13, Kids' Choice Awards, Nick.com, KCA, Alexa Nicholas, I do not know who Alexa Nicholas is, L'Oreal Excellence, just all these things. I don't even know what some of these things are. And so I think it just goes to show that sometimes it's not the search terms by the voters themselves, but you learn something about those communities. And what this means is that there's information even in our web searches. And what this means is that polling can go in new directions as more and more information becomes available on a pretty granular basis. And I think there's a huge application for this to basically separate us more than we already are politically. And so I think there's a big question. There's an opportunity from a data analytics point of view, but there's also a very negative thing, which is that all these ways of communicating with one another in a very narrow way through cable news or talk radio or email. This new information technology provides more ways to speak to each other through very narrow channels. And I have to admit that I'm a little bit concerned about that. Okay, and you can see here that in fact Google Correlate did a super good job. These are all predictions from Google Correlate. It turns out that Google Correlate basically did as well as polls on the 538 website and did better than the Real Clear Politics average, and also did better than the prior demographic assumptions of the 538 model. So without polling, Google Correlate in some sense does about twice as well as a demographic model based on race and ethnicity and religion. And so if you think about the power of Google Correlate, it really does extremely well. And so I think that in some level this may be part of the future of data analytics and making predictions about elections. Okay, so I've already talked for too long. I apologize for that. I hope that we get a discussion going. For those of you who would like, polls show a margin of 5 points or more. So the margin is less than 5 points. Effectively, the betting sites are much less certain than polls data. And so I would say that betting sites offer basically a really blurry version of what polls can tell you. So I think that, honestly, just to put it really concretely, if you do a good job aggregating polling data the week before the election, you can make money on betting sites. There's no question about that. It's definitely possible to make money on betting sites using that. Because betting markets do a good job of aggregating conventional wisdom, but they don't necessarily extract all the possible probabilities. And if you think about companies that do market analytics to figure out inefficiencies in the market and find ways to make money, what they're basically doing is calculating their own probabilities, comparing what the market thinks, and basically finding ways to leverage some of the money. And betting sites are no different than the stock market. The other question is, why is my site more confident about the outcome than 538? Yeah, there's two answers here. So just to familiarize people, actually probably people mostly know that, I don't know, what's Nate Silver's Clinton win probability right now?
69.
68%, and mine's like, in the high 90s. Right. Okay, good, so you read the site. Right, so there's several things going on. The first thing is that their site is very interested in predicting individual state races, and so they first do a good job of trying to get that down, and then they take those and then they aggregate those into a model. And in order to make all those corrections, they actually introduce uncertainties. And so there are uncertainties that in some sense get counted twice, and then they bring in multiple national polls to try to give an up-to-the-moment snapshot. And so there are ways, and the national polls turn out to be not that good. And so there are ways in which uncertainties get added in because they're interested in giving up-to-the-minute state-by-state estimates. I don't care about any of that. So all I want is the November outcome. And so what I do is I take all the stakeholders, put them into a single snapshot that's really high precision, and then I study the statistical properties of that. And it turns out that that is dominated by swings in national opinion. And so I can study the statistical properties of that and basically do simple stuff like calculate things like the standard deviation of this quantity here. Right? And you can see here that basically it's been about 4% for Clinton ahead by about 4% all year. And then it's got a standard deviation of, like I said earlier, about 1%. And so that's where the meta margin has been. And so then the question is, okay, on election day, how far off the poll is going to be? And it turns out that this meta margin has really excellent statistical properties. And so now then the second part of the answer is that they've been, at 538, they've taken a really cautious, conservative in the non-political sense. They've taken a conservative approach of looking at all elections going back decades to figure out what might happen. And they're not taking into account two facts. The first is that this year, empirically, things have not moved very much. And the second thing is that before 1992, things moved a lot more. And so they're taking the conservative view, well, you know what, anything could happen. It could be as volatile as 1964 and 1968. And, you know, these 68 is like one of the most wrenching presidential campaigns in history. They said, well, you know, it's emotionally volatile this year, anything can happen, so we should factor that in. And so what I would say is that those are the principal differences, and I think that I would say that my approach is very focused on the final outcome and also very focused on the statistical properties of this quantity. I should also say that we're under very different market pressure. So his market pressure is that it's good to have people coming back and reading and following horse race because his business model is color commentary and sports commentary. My business model that I said at the beginning, well, first off, my business model is that for maximum success in my career, you should all go away. Because, in fact, I do scientific research and teach students. So that's what it is. But secondly, the reason I run the website is to help people with resource allocation, which ironically, even though I run the non-commercial site, I'm interested in helping people allocate their resources as efficiently as possible, as if they were working at D.E. Shaw or some other quant financial company. And so my MO is I want you to be able to give your money and efforts most efficiently. And my view about that is, okay, I want as much precision as possible. And guess what? Getting out the vote for Hillary Clinton, as much as it might make you feel good if you're a Hillary Clinton supporter, isn't actually the way to advance your agenda. The way to advance your agenda is to get over to, you know, 5th District of New Jersey or what have you. Anyway, it's kind of a long answer, but thank you for the question. And because I'm preparing to reply, because now people, you know, people want to know, like 99%, 68%, what's going on there? Yeah, where's the mic?
Next question is all the way to the right.
Okay, all right.
The Brexit decision, do you think that was just a failure of conventional wisdom or also a polling error? And if the answer is it was also a polling error, that suggests that we could see
wisdom. So the question is, what failed in Brexit? Brexit gets held up as a polling error. And I have to say, I have to stick up for the pollsters, less so UK pollsters, because they have a tougher job that they had to do there. But if you look at pre-election Brexit polling, it was too close to call. Leave was lagging behind, but Leave was lagging Remain, but by no more than about 1 percentage point. So it was too close to call. There were 9% undecideds right up until the vote. And so, you know, I posted on my website. I mean, it wasn't something that was that important to me because my feeling was, oh yeah, they're going to stay. All the pundits are saying they're going to stay. And so I just almost, as an afterthought, I put up on my website, you know, I think they're going to stay, but honestly, it's too close to call. So why don't we wait and see? And that was what I said. You can go look it up. And so it turns out that in fact, you know, obviously Leave won. There was some polling error. And I think it just goes to show that one-off questions often are difficult to poll, whether it be Scotland independence, right? The Scotland referendum is one example of that, and the Brexit referendum is another example of that. I think these one-off things are hard to poll, especially when they carry, you know, so much. You know, there's so much weight in the UK attached to how that referendum did. Does it carry lessons for the U.S.? I would say probably not, because honestly, presidential polling is probably the single most technically mature form of opinion polling that there is. And opinion polls have done such a good job in the last 3 presidential elections. And furthermore, pollsters are always experimenting. And it turns out to be a technically kind of interesting field where they're constantly finding new ways to reach voters. So my take on this is that because of the high density of polling in the U.S. and the high quality of the aggregated high quality of polling, the biggest imaginable error for polling in the U.S. is going to be, you know, a big error in the United States in a presidential year would be about very much in flux and very much depends on high quality data. And so people like the Huffington Post turn out to be important because they curate data by looking at the technical standards of pollsters and saying, well, did you do a real poll? And so that's important. I think that this is something to keep an eye on. There are researchers, there's people like David Rothschild and Sharad Goel who are affiliated with Microsoft Research who do research on these topics. There's people at the Upshot who have an interest in this. I think it's a moving target. And at some level, you know, I express a lot of confidence in state polling, which have done so well in the past. But, you know, at some level, every election we're doing a new experiment, we being educators, doing a new experiment and seeing how the data will be useful. And so, you know, this Google Correlate thing I showed is interesting to me because it's a totally orthogonal new way of coming in. Over here. Okay.
Hi there. First, thank you. Spectacular presentation. Regarding polarization, I'm very curious if any data you've looked at has anything to say about the cause and effect relationship, perhaps, between the elected candidate and the public. So, has there been a vicious cycle of increasing polarization from the public wanting more and more extreme right or extreme left candidates?
Yeah.
Or have the
It's a
candidates...
good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so where does polarization come from and how do we draw the causal arrows? The difficulty being that we don't have any good way of assessing cause and effect under most circumstances. This is a hard problem. Now, you know, obviously I have a speculative interpretation, which is that empirically something happened in voting patterns in the 1990s. And empirically that is the time when communication became rapid and narrowcast on the Republican side. And also coincides with the time when, if you look at quantitative measures of extremism from the center, right, the median Republican deviated quite far from the median member of Congress. The median Democrat moved a little bit in the other direction, but not nearly so much. And so there's this divergence. That divergence happened in the 1970s and 80s, basically starting in the Watergate Vietnam. So there is some difficulty in knowing where the upstream causes are. If you look at state-by-state correlations, the biggest election to election changed from 60 to 64, when states that were reliably more Democratic than average, like the Deep South, suddenly became more Republican than average, and vice versa. And so there was a total scramble in the correlation coefficient between 64 is minus 5.
Like he just ran a fucking marathon.
If you start thinking about how these things go, as it's cause and effect, it's hard to know. But, you know, a storyline might be something like civil rights and the Kennedy assassination made possible the pushing through of civil rights. Civil rights legislation laid bare the Democratic Party's agenda of being pro-civil rights. White Southern Democrats left the party. There's an ideological purification of the party that led to separation of the party. Then through Watergate, through the 70s and 80s, further polarization. And then in the 90s, what gets added to the recipe is ways for people to organize rapidly, right, instantaneously. Donald Trump said this week, and it appears in my handheld, like, within seconds. I know what the Donald was thinking, like, you know, it's amazing. So these things become quite rapid. Now, which way do the causal arrows go? I think there's a lot of evidence on this, and I think the storylines will probably end up being something like what I just said. Now we live in an age where communication by being distant from them, and by working out basically best policies and best practices without having people yelling them all. That's not the way Madison put it. But, you know, the general idea is to separate the passions of the mob from the legislative chief's job as a person. And just to state the obvious, this separation is not available. If I get angry at my congressman, I can reach my congressman really rapidly. If Donald Trump wants to talk back to his followers, that's a bidirectional conversation. We're going to go back and forth. And so there are some ways in which Madisonian democracy is dead. And there are some ways in which there needs to be an adaptation to these new kinds of communication. You know, the pessimistic outcome is that these modes of communication create ruled by the mob. And so the question is how to escape that. And I think that these things are, you know, political scientists don't necessarily think this way. I'm about to put it, which is that these are made possible by technology. Technology has made these things possible. There's something qualitatively different about politics today than politics 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 200 years ago. I think this is a huge challenge. And I'm sorry that I don't have an answer for you about cause and effect, but I do find that this is an interesting topic, despite 20 million dollars.
We're voting back here.
Okay. Yeah.
I was wondering if you've done any exploration into incorporating early ballot returns into how you interpret polls. I know like on the website right now they have the North Carolina early ballot tracker, but it doesn't look like it's used in their overall model. You've tried it, it doesn't work.
Right. Right. So the question is whether early voting can be used to make predictions or to refine projections. Just a small note about the upshot thing. I'm not entirely convinced about what they're doing because they seem to see the entire analysis in polling data. And my general feeling about this is that I think that early voting data is a valuable source of information. Currently, you have to compare it with what happened 4 years ago in order to get a matched comparison. Because there are a lot of factors that might distort how it reflects the vote outcome. And secondly, my own case is that given the complexities of interpreting even one kind of data, my own preference is that I like keeping data streams separate where I can see them. And so my preference is to have the polling data in one place where I can look at it, and have the early voting data in another place where I can look at it, and not put them together unless I really have to. And, one can imagine it for resource allocation. So I actually think that polling data is sufficient. One thing to observe from early voting this year is if you look at comparisons between early voting this year and 4 years ago, it seems like Democrats seem to be doing a little bit better at the presidential level than 4 years ago, but not everywhere. Broadly speaking, it generally seems to be the case that the polls seem to be approximately correct and there are no major errors. And that's more or less the sense I'm getting out of this year's vote. I can imagine putting them together, but I just think that one has to be careful because I think the data streams are interesting separately. Certainly one can imagine doing a better job of combining these data. And that's probably part of the future of aggregation.
Another question around personal life.
Yep.
How much was that?
Yep. Hello?
One question about historical data.
Yeah, I know we all feel this is a different area. But, so, emotions are different and issues are different. How much we worry about the outcome is different. But the act of polling is fundamentally a technical activity where, it's like weighing ears of corn. I mean, this is just not, I think there are ways in which it's a relatively cut and dried activity. And there are certain errors that can come into play, but some of those errors have not come to pass. So, for instance, there's some talk about how there are hidden Trump voters. That turns out probably not to be the case because they haven't really shown up in voter registration. If you look at lie detector polls versus robotic polls, there hasn't been a difference. And so I think that a lot of those fears mostly have not come to pass. And I think that, maybe I'll eat my words, but certainly in a very few days you can come email me and laugh at me about it. But my general sense from early voting and from what happens in the primaries and the polls and lose the job, my general sense is that polls are doing fine. And we actually have a pretty clear view of what's going on Tuesday. And I think that the drama and the emotionality is very much in what's going to happen on Capitol Hill across the country. Not that's my general opinion. So I'd say drama and data are different.
And we have time for just a few more questions, but I'm going to another Twitter question, which is, given the recent accusations of the election being rigged, whether you have thought is it possible, and if it were rigged, now or ever, how would that?
Elections probably can't be rigged in a direct, literal sense of faking election results because American voting has been antiquated and distributed and disorganized. So there's not any one way to hack American voting. So just purely on that basis alone, it is pretty hard to rig an election. Now, generally speaking, election fakery, again, the United States is quite advanced in many ways. I think we don't really appreciate how good we have it. America is great now. And I think a safeguard against fraud is basically the idea that we have election, pre-election polling. It's going to give us a pretty strong idea of where public opinion is now. There could be subtle fraud, but I would be pretty surprised if there were more. So I think election rigging in that sense. I think sometimes if you think about rigging in more metaphorical sense, is the system rigged against people who are outside the system? Yeah, this is the political theory the party decides. But I would say, this is going to sound kind of fussy of me, but I think it's good to have well-functioning political parties that adjudicate differences between different factions and work out what should be worked on. And to me, I don't view that as conspiratorial thing. I think that a well-functioning political system is very much rigged, where people have ways of getting their opinions out. Getting their opinions out. So, there's different ways to interpret the word. Those would be my answer.
And then we have another question, Fran.
Everybody loves percent probabilities and that kind of stuff because it makes us feel comfortable. But of course, we all know that improbable events do happen. So in the case when you're analyzing your model and modeling, your model predicts something with 95% confidence, and the opposite happens, would you interpret that as a failure of the model, or just saying that something that has had a 5% chance of happening?
Right. This is the difficulty with dealing with probabilities. I think generally speaking, there's difficulty with public interpretation of probabilities. Broadly speaking, I think that the general public interpretation of any probability greater than 60% is, wow, my guy is in, that's fantastic. But if you stop and think about it, the probability of 51% was really basically the same as 50-50. So I think there's a general problem with public interpretation of probabilities, where in my book, anything that's between 20 and 80% is not certain at all, which is why, just speaking personally, I am extremely focused on who controls the Senate next year, because I view that as being totally unreal. Now, you talk about probabilities in excess of 90%. At this point, this becomes pretty model dependent. I would say that if you look at different probabilities, like at the Upshot and my website, at some level, those probabilities are not all that different. Where I'm at 99 with 98%, and the Upshot is at 90%. Those are at some level saying pretty similar things, where they're both saying, look, it's really likely that the presidency is going to go this direction next Tuesday. But extreme events can happen, and these are models that attempt to calculate based on polls and demographics and other information what's likely to happen next Tuesday. Look, if there's a dual tsunami that hits the west and east coast of the United States, or a meteor strike in California, it would be a large meteor, right? But sure, there are crazy events that can happen, and I think one generally has to accept that once you get to the extremes in excess of 90%, 95%, you're in a domain where the way I would put it is, let's say I'll put it this way. If something happens to alter the election next week, I would say that the kind of event that would move the race that much is not the kind of event where you would blame me for being wrong. It would be something like a tsunami or something. And, pardon me for saying so, but I think I'm off the hook. I think we have bigger concerns with something like that. So I think probabilities are something that one has to treat carefully. The other thing I would say is that one can look at detailed analytics, like state-by-state races. There are a lot of interesting ways that one can validate not just the bottom line, not just the top line probability, but state-by-state margins. Just as an example, I think.
It's actually over there.
So it is polling awareness of the political environment alters. So one example is East Coast results affect West Coast turnout that we study. Another example is that in states that are really lopsided, winner usually wins by something like 25% more than voters in states where the person really fly or something. Just scare them. Or maybe it's the polls aren't really necessarily have to do that. They just have to create these things are hard to win. There was some circumstantial evidence for polls affecting voting in states. I'm going to undermine the whole hobby I have by saying I think it's reasonable information that is honestly, that is this thing of something we're going to be able to bring to our lives are important things that we need to talk about. And if you're hundreds of hours dozens of hours paid to clean out the room. And no hours, so less than 1 hour, would all make it apply to climate change, immigration, tax policy. Those are important. You have to go to the opinions of they have to say, and you know, it's the thing they have to say, right? Because otherwise you're not here for it. And I think it's always like, I don't know. I don't consider it all for the way that I am to be fun because it's so that things that rather than
I don't know. Dan? I don't know. Meetup group? Asian. Asian meetup group? We gotta go, yeah. I was watching the rest of the lecture, and then she just comes up and says like, "Don't I know you?" And I'm like, and she was like, "I don't know from where." And I was like, "You sing dance? You need a group?" Like, yeah. She said, "Yeah," but then I was like, "Well, Asian meetup group, Filipino meetup group." Yeah, I guess not. I'm like, I don't recognize her at all, like completely and utterly at all. So like, that's just yeah. And then it was like, this like the lecture just ended, and people are gonna rush the elevator. They're like, I need to get out of here. You know, like I'm not gonna sit there and talk to you.
Wait, what? And
this one's closed. Okay. I was like on there, like, oh my God, you need to come back as soon as possible because like he's almost done, you know, like just like I want to get in the elevator like right now.
I saw you talking and like I took the bus and when I come over.
That's when you can be like, oh thank God you're here. I just need to I gotta go. Yeah.